Spinning about at the sound, I was relieved at not being faced with a robotic adversary, but I kept my carbine raised nonetheless. Standing across the room with a peculiar rifle trained on me was the young East Asian maintenance technician I had seen a month before at my first visit to Bedlam. Glancing over her shoulder, I could see that she carried a heavy-laden rucksack on her back. The weapon she held was unlike any gun I had ever seen before. In place of a barrel, there was a short, tightly wound copper coil surmounted by a small metal toroid. Surrounding this coil and extending for about a yard in length was what looked like a cage of large wire mesh. I stood there, not saying a word, as the engineer looked me up and down. I must have appeared more than a little unnerved and possibly frantic after finding the heads, but for whatever reason she lowered her weapon and told me to keep quiet and follow her. After all the mechanized terrors I had run afoul of that evening, I did not know whether to trust this woman or not. She was not a doctor, perhaps she was not complicit in what had been done. Could Raspel's inhuman scheme run so deep that even the custodial staff were involved? Perhaps I instinctively knew that she meant no harm to me, or perhaps I was willing to follow any being of flesh and blood, but when she opened the door and motioned for me once more to follow her, I followed. The corridor was as black as it had been before, but the furor outside had stopped. I shuddered at what this implied, and tightened my grip on my rifle. My guide produced a small lantern from her tool belt and secured it to her odd weapon, which lit the corridor enough for us to see our way. The technician said nothing apart from a sharp whispered warning to step lightly as we crept forward. I was still in a state of trance-like apprehension after what I had seen, so I did not think to question where she was leading me. We soon came to the lift at the end of the corridor, and my guide drew open the gate and stepped inside, beckoning me after her. I lingered on the threshold for a moment, but soon stepped inside. The technician shut the gate behind me and pressed the second-floor button. There was a grating metal groan as the lift jolted upward, and I prayed that its noisome creaking would not be heard by any of the iron cutthroats that could be lurking behind any dark corner of that sepulchral madhouse. The lift screeched to a halt on the second floor, and the technician opened the gate and exited to the right. I promptly followed after her, but paused. Her course led toward the center of the hospital. She did not mean to lead me to an egress. I turned and glanced down the other end of the hallway into near impenetrable gloom, considering if I should not break off from my guide and try to escape on my own. The engineer must have seen me look back, for from over my shoulder I heard her frankly remark, "I don't like your chances." As eager as I was to quit the asylum forever, she was right. I could not find my way out of the blackened halls of this place without a lantern, and if I were to come up against any opposition, robotic or otherwise, I would surely not fare well. I had no option but to follow the technician and hope she would not lead me into peril. We made our way through the east wing, passing by countless unlit cells, the pitiable occupants of which were audibly disturbed, at which I did not wonder. Encompassed in shadow and tormented by the nightmarish reports of slaughterous conflict from without, their terrified howling was nearly as blood-curdling as that of the massacred officers had been outside. As the light from the technician's lantern swept over the walls, the wretched souls would stretch their hands through the barred windows on their cell doors, as if grasping for some imagined salvation. The last time I had walked through those walls, it had felt as if I were passing through purgatory. Now it felt that I was truly descending into Hades. The only modicum of comfort I derived was that our passage would surely go unnoticed amidst such havoc. But I was mistaken. After about 100 feet, my guide turned right down an intersecting corridor, and at once we were confronted by 3 orderlies, armed with pressurized rifles. Evidently, Raspel's henchmen were not exclusively mechanical. Before the technician or I could raise our weapons, the orderlies had trained theirs on ours. One of them barked at us to drop our guns. We had no choice but to yield. As I placed my carbine on the floor, I heard one of the hoodlums scowl to another that she wouldn't want any surviving witnesses. For a split second it seemed that we were done for. But in an instant turn of circumstance, the third orderly spun his rifle about and struck one of his supposed cohorts on the back of the head, knocking the goon unconscious. The other one turned in confusion, but before he could retaliate, the technician lunged forward and head-butted him in the face. He collapsed beside his fallen comrade, and I stood, confounded, as the technician knelt down to pick up her queer weapon. It was only then that I realized that the third orderly, the one who had struck the first, was the same man that I had seen in suspicious colloquy with the technician that day when I had first come to Bedlam. It seemed that I was right to wonder at the exchange I had then seen. They were undeniably in cahoots, and had been for some time. The orderly exchanged a few familiar words with the technician, and then looked at me. He did not seem to wonder at my presence, but instructed me to pick up my rifle and keep moving. I was not given the chance to question, as the two had already begun down the hall once more. I took up my carbine, and followed in puzzled but swift pursuit. As we continued toward the hospital center, I overheard my two unlikely companions trading information. Whatever their true purpose was in this insanitarium, it seemed that they had somehow anticipated the chaotic events of that night. The technician remarked that all of the hospital's automata were still positioned out front, and the orderly responded that the doc and the captain were waiting for them in the atrium. Apparently, this covert company had two additional members stationed at the hospital center. I pondered over the possible true identities of these peculiar individuals, all the while staying closely in step behind them. We came at last to a set of double doors, through which we entered into the atrium. This multi-terraced chamber was the central ward where the most extremely disturbed patients were held, a fact which made the hushed silence all the more worrisome. The inmates of the East Ward, through which we had come, had been consumed in a frenzied torrent of manic dread, but those confined here, allegedly the furthest unhinged from common sanity, seemed entirely unaffected by the surrounding turmoil or the near-total darkness. Like the rest of the hospital, the atrium was entirely unlit. The only illumination came from the glass-walled panopticon beneath the dome overhead, where at least one dim lamp appeared to be shining. Undoubtedly, Raspel was held up there, controlling her murderous automaton from some remote console. We were on the second terrace, two below the upper ring with a suspended gangway connected to the panopticon. My two odd escorts proceeded left along the noiseless, lightless cells until they stopped outside cell number 215. I remembered this cell. It was that of the Mad Hatter, the manic patient who had permanently fastened a nonsensical top hat to his crown. Could this lunatic and his private physician be the other confederates of the subversive crew into which I had fallen? It certainly seemed so, for upon reaching the door the orderly knocked briskly 3 times, paused for a beat, and then knocked twice more. Presently the door swung open, revealing the tall Bavarian doctor helping his mad-hatted patient out of a straitjacket. The inmate was even more eccentric-looking than I had been led to believe. In addition to his outlandish top hat, with its enigmatic clockwork elements ticking and turning continuously, he wore upon his bearded face an equally preposterous pair of brass goggles. Beneath his straitjacket he wore a collared shirt, waistcoat, and bow tie, though upon the right side of his chest there was what appeared to be some kind of mechanical coronary implant. What manner of man was this, that with 3 accomplices had infiltrated a mental asylum? And to what end? Discarding the straitjacket, he donned a brown greatcoat and fully stocked tool belt that the technician removed from her rucksack. From the same rucksack she withdrew 3 large sidearms, similar in design to the unusual rifle she carried, and distributed them to her 3 cohorts. I took a step closer to the open doorway, intent on gaining some enlightenment to whatever plot was afoot, when the Mad Hatter looked up and caught sight of me. He stared at my face and at my constable's helmet, and a wide grin came over his face. Perhaps he truly was mad, for he then burst into a near-hysterical fit of stifled laughter, to which the others paid no mind, through which he chortled, "You must be having an interesting night, eh?" I was so thrown by his laughter that I could not bring myself to make a response. In any case, it seemed that these characters had no intention of wasting time explaining anything to me. The doctor, moving past me out into the atrium, drew a small set of multi-lensed binoculars from his coat and glanced upward at the half-lit panopticon. He stated plainly in his bass Bavarian accent, 20 on the bridge. I estimate 110 hertz would be sufficient. At this remark, the orderly, the technician, and the Mad Hatter made several adjustments to their weapons, after which the Hatter stepped forward and addressed his comrades in a low but confident tone. "Righto, lads and lovelies, just like we planned. Get in, get on with it, get it over with, and get out." Then he turned to me. "My good blue bottle," he began, "if you would be so kind as to cover our rear, and do not fire your weapon unless absolutely necessary." I was not accustomed to following orders that were not given by my commanding officers, but opposing this crew of mavericks seemed foolish in light of the circumstances, so I followed once more. Proceeding around the terrace to the other side, they led me through a door and up 2 flights of stairs to the upper tier of the atrium. Before us lay the bridge reaching across to the panopticon, and it was not vacant. Barring our passage were 20 men and women in white coats standing in ranks with deadpan countenances and heavy iron pipes in their hands. The hospital's surgeons standing guard, protecting their master physician. None of them were of particularly intimidating physique, but they stood like tin soldiers, identical in posture and stance and expression. Armed only with blunt instruments, they did not appear to be a substantial threat, but they were numerous, and as we approached the gangway they began to advance, brandishing their pipes. I reached for my truncheon, but before I could draw it, my 4 unlikely allies had raised their fantastic weapons and fired. With resounding clamor, concentrated arcs of electrical fury shot forth like lightning from the toroids on their guns, striking the surgeons in the center of their heads. At each strike, they did not cry out in pain, but simply dropped, prostrate, to the floor. All 20 of them were down in mere seconds. Once again I was astounded, but the 4 madcaps did not linger to appreciate their work. They proceeded across the bridge, stepping over the limp bodies as they went. I knelt down to inspect one of the bodies. Though I could detect a pulse, the eyes had remained open and the aspect of the face remained blank. It seemed impossible that a man could have survived such a bolt of force to the head, let alone feel no pain from it. But again, I hadn't the time to think on it. A loud bang drew my sights forward again, and I saw that the orderly and the Hatter were ramming against the doors of the panopticon with their shoulders. After 3 impacts, the door gave way and the crew rushed in. I leapt to my feet and ran after them. When I reached the panopticon, the crew of 4 had their electrical armaments trained on Dr. Raspel, who was standing over what looked like an elaborate analog control panel on the other side of the room, with her back turned to us. By this point, I was in a state of nervous exhilaration, so when she turned about and pointed a revolver at us, instinct got the better of me, and I raised my carbine and shot her square in the head. She fell lifeless to the floor with a thud. Unaccustomed to employing lethal force, I was more than a little shaken by my own action, but my companions seemed more than a little vexed by it. All 4 of them stared at me with a look of startled discontent. Perhaps they had meant to apprehend Raspel alive, but she had aimed a gun at us. Was I not right to react as I had? Regardless, they continued to glare at me until a dull noise, percussive and metallic, sounded from above. All 5 of us looked to the ceiling as the noises increased and broadened, the definite hum of some large electrical machinery. I recalled the unusual wireless tower I had seen rise from the hospital's dome, and wondered briefly at what else the dome could be hiding, when I realized that the 4 misfits were once again staring at me. The technician put her gloved palm to her face and let out an exasperated sigh. The Hatter shook his head. "You've done it now," he said apprehensively.